Listen, warriors and maidens, for I bring you the tale of a man whose name echoes through the ages, etched in the wood of Drekers and the blood of his enemies. Sit by the fire, let the mead flow, and let Odin's ravens be witness. For this is the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, son of storm and war. Born under the watchful eye of the gods, Ragnar came into the world shrouded in promise and omen. Some say he was the son of Sigurd Ring, the great king of Sweden, and with a gaze as sharp as blades. Others whisper that his lineage bore the blood of Odin, for his thirst for conquest was no ordinary man's. From an early age, destiny called to him, and he answered with the fierce laughter of those who fear not death. He grew up among warriors, wielding sword and axe before he could even understand words. His spirit burned like the heavens at dawn, and his mind was as sharp as the blade of the sea. While still young, Ragnar demonstrated his cunning and strength when he faced a tyrannical Jarl who was plundering his people's lands. But it wasn't just with his blade that he won, because the young Viking understood that the battle was fought with both iron and intelligence. With only a few men, he lured the enemy army into a narrow valley, where shields became walls and spears danced like serpents. The Jarl fell, and Ragnar took for himself the first of many titles. But a true warrior is not content with a single victory. His heart cried out for unknown seas and battles worthy of sagas. Armed with an indomitable spirit, he sailed to the kingdom of the Franks, where he walked the proud walls of Paris. He was not yet a king, but kings have his name. With Drekers as swift as the winds of Njord and warriors thirsty for glory, he tore down cities and fortresses, proving that nowhere was safe from the Norse fury. His facades earned him the title of Lothbrok, because in one of his battles, he represented a giant serpent, dressed only in thick leather pants to resist the creature's venom. It is said that the beast succumbed to his axe, and the gods smiled at his courage. Since then, no one dared to challenge Ragnar without feeling a chill down their spine upon hearing his name. But true glory does not reside in the sword alone, and Ragnar knew this. With his charisma and bravery, he gathered around him the fiercest warriors and the most loyal allies. Battle after battle, land after land, his fame grew like a storm on the high seas. The king of Denmark, an aging and weakened man, saw Ragnar as a threat and tried to crush him before he became too great. But Ragnar was not a man to be dominated. With the thunder of Thor in his heart and the fury of the winds in his sails, Ragnar marched against the king of Denmark. The battle was fierce, spears were broken, and the battlefield was a sea of shattered shields. And as the sun sank below the horizon, Ragnar drew his sword, and the crown of Denmark fell at his feet. He had not taken the throne by force alone, but because the Danish warriors themselves saw him as their true leader, a man who not only commanded, but lived and died for his people. Thus Ragnar Lothbrok became king, not by right of blood, but by the strength of his deeds. But, brothers, do you think the saga ends here? No, the legend of Ragnar was only beginning, and the gods still had many paths to open for the son of war. The icy north wind cut like invisible blades, whipping through the shaggy hair of the warriors gathered in the great hall of Darkwood. A fire crackled in the center, casting distorted shadows on the walls covered with shields and battle trophies. Ragnar Lothbrok, a wolf among men, sat on the rough throne of his fortress, his eyes fixed on the hand-drawn map on the table. His calloused fingers traced the contours of Sweden, a fertile land rich in furs, gold, and prestige. But it was not just glory or riches that he desired this land. There was something greater at stake, something few understood. Rumors drifted across the fjords like whispering ghosts. They said that the Swedish kings, divided by internal strife, were vulnerable. A rare opportunity for a cunning leader like Ragnar, who saw beyond brute force and knew that a well-planned war was won before the first blade was drawn. He did not wish to simply plunder, as so many before him had done. He wished to build something lasting, a legacy that would echo to the farthest corners of the known world. Yet conquering Sweden would not be so simple. There were alliances to be made, gods to be consulted, and battles to be fought both in the land and in the hearts of his own warriors. As the mead was poured and the skalds sang of deeds past, Ragnar rose to his feet. Silence fell across the hall. His men waited expectantly, knowing that their leader never spoke without purpose. With a predatory smile, he raised his voice, echoing like thunder over the shoulders of those present. The time has come to test our steel against the kings of Sweden. Many have tried, few have returned to tell the tale. Will we be remembered as conquerors, or forgotten as dust in the wind? The roar of the warriors in response shook the rafters of the hall. The fate had been sealed, and the march to Sweden was about to begin. Ragnar Lothbrok, now king of Denmark, knew there was no rest for those who wore a crown made of iron and blood. Enemies lurked like wolves in the darkness, and the gods tested his strength with challenges that only the truly great could endure. It was not long before the Jarls, lords of lands and armies, began to whisper among themselves. Ragnar was a legendary warrior, yes, but did he know how to rule? Did he have the gift to keep a kingdom prosperous beyond the blade of his axe? Some thought not, and challenged him. The first came from the north, a warlord named Hakon, who gathered an army of traitors and landed on Danish shores, intent on tearing the crown from Ragnar's head. But the king was not a man to sit idly by in his hall. Before Hakon could deploy his forces, Ragnar attacked. He did not march in a straight line like a fool, but used cunning, dividing his army and forcing the enemy to fight on treacherous terrain. He caught the invaders off guard on the hillsides, where the ground was muddy and Hakon's shields were useless. It was here that Ragnar showed that he was not just a hero of the sagas, but a leader who understood that the mind could be as sharp as a blade. With arrows piercing the sky and war cries echoing like thunder, Hakon fell, and his head was sent back north as a warning to those who would dare defy the king. But a king does not fight only against men. Ragnar had to face the very forces of nature to protect his kingdom. A relentless winter ravaged Denmark, and the fields dried like ashes in the wind. The people went hungry, and the wrath of the gods seemed to weigh down on the king's lands. But Ragnar was not a man to bend the knee. Rather than wait for death to come, he called his council together and decided to make a bold attack, a raid against the Saxon kingdoms to the south, where the granaries were overflowing and the Christian kings slept too safely in their stone fortresses. And so the Drakars were driven into the sea, slithering like hungry serpents. In the fury of hunger and need, Ragnar and his warriors invaded Northumbria, where they found unprotected cities and monasteries stuffed with gold. But make no mistake, brothers, Ragnar was no thoughtless butcher. He knew when the sword should give way to gold. After ravaging villages and showing his strength, he negotiated tribute with the Saxon lords, ensuring supplies for his people without prolonging the war any longer than necessary. The ships returned to Denmark laden with grain, salted meat, and riches, and the winter was overcome, not by the mercy of the gods, but by the courage and cunning of the king. But the challenges never cease for those who bear the weight of the crown. Treachery crept into the halls of power, and Ragnar knew that not all who served him did so out of unwavering loyalty. Among the Jarls, some plotted quietly, waiting for the right moment to stab him in the back. And the most dangerous among them was Harald Grey Wolf, a feared warrior whose heart was made of ice and ambition. He began to spread lies, saying that Ragnar had grown soft, that he preferred negotiation to fighting, that the gods no longer watched over him. And so Harald raised his own army and marched against the king. hoping that doubt had weakened his leadership. But Ragnar knew the game of war and power. He did not wait for the storm to break upon him. He struck first. He divided his men into 3 groups, using Harold's own arrogance against him. As the traitor's forces advanced on what appeared to be a small contingent of Ragnar's army, they walked right into the trap. Shields closed around them like the jaws of a wolf, and in a fierce battle in the rain, Harold was slain by none other than the king himself. His head was held high before the Jarls, and Ragnar proclaimed, "May this be the fate of all who mistake mercy for weakness." With his enemies crushed and his position consolidated, Ragnar looked beyond the horizon. Denmark was secure, but the eyes of his people yearned for more. Sagas are not written by those who are content with what they already have. The sea called, and new kingdoms waited to be challenged. Ragnar knew that his fate was still being woven by the gods. With Denmark finally stabilized under his rule, Ragnar felt that the kingdom, however vast and powerful it might be, was no longer enough to fuel his ambition. The throne of Denmark, which he had conquered with so much effort, seemed too small for the grandeur of his plans. Ragnar, king of the Vikings, no longer saw himself as the leader of a single nation, but as a ruler with a right to more land, more wealth and, above all, more power. It was then that, on a silent winter afternoon, as he looked at maps and listened to the winds blowing from the north, Ragnar made a decision that would change the course of his reign: to expand his domains into Sweden. The neighboring kingdom, with its vast forests and mountains, was rich in natural resources, especially iron, timber, and precious minerals. The Swedish tribes, for their part, were numerous, but they were divided, with various factions fighting among themselves. For Ragnar, this was a unique opportunity to unite these tribes under his rule and thus consolidate an even stronger Norse empire. The first step in this expansion began with a series of strategic attacks on the small Swedish kingdoms that bordered the south. Ragnar did not rush to invade the strongest centers immediately. Instead, he launched a series of quick and precise raids, striking the coastal villages and weakening the local defenders. His tactics were simple but effective. The Vikings plundered while at the same time sending a clear message: anyone who tried to resist their will would suffer the consequences. The Swedish warriors, however numerous, were accustomed to clan warfare, but Ragnar brought them something different: a cohesive, well-trained army with a leadership that inspired loyalty and respect. Ragnar's fame preceded his raids, and soon many of the Swedish tribes began to see his arrival not as a threat but as an opportunity. He presented himself not as a ruthless conqueror, but as a leader capable of bringing order and stability to the chaotic lands of Sweden. After months of raiding, Ragnar decided to take a bolder step. He approached the southernmost regions, where the warring clans were most fierce and resistant to the idea of giving in to any foreign ruler. There, King Sverker, the most powerful leader in Sweden at the time, ruled with an iron fist. Known for his military strength and immense popularity among the northern clans, Sverker was, in Ragnar's view, the only real obstacle to his expansion. Ragnar knew that he could not conquer Sverker directly through brute force without losing too much in terms of resources and men. So he decided to take a more strategic and subtle approach. He sent emissaries to negotiate with Sverker, offering him an alliance rather than a direct confrontation. In exchange for his loyalty, Ragnar offered support against the other Swedish kingdoms that still resisted his expansion. Ragnar's proposal was bold. He knew that if he could convince Sverker to join him, the Swedish king would be forced to submit to the authority of a more powerful leader, but he would still retain his position and control over his lands. Sverker hesitated for a while, but Ragnar's words were intelligent and well articulated. He spoke of the benefits of an alliance that would ensure prosperity for both kingdoms through trade, mutual protection, and joint military strength against common enemies. The negotiations were tense, but eventually Sverker accepted the alliance. Denmark and northern Sweden were now under Ragnar's rule. However, this alliance, as Ragnar well knew, would not last forever. The Swedish tribes, accustomed to their independence, would be difficult to control in the long term. Ragnar could not expect his victory to be easy or permanent. With Sverker at his side, Ragnar set about organizing the administration of the new territory. He appointed governors in various regions and implemented a series of reforms to ensure that the conquered lands would be well integrated into the Danish Empire. But the king knew that the greatest challenge would be maintaining control over the various Swedish factions, each with their own traditions and deep loyalties. The battle to unify Sweden would ultimately be fought not only on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of his people. What Ragnar did not know was that the seeds of discord had already been planted. The alliance with Sverker, advantageous as it was, had also aroused the envy and ambition of other Swedish leaders. As Ragnar consolidated his power in the south, some tribes began to question the legitimacy of his rule. And, as is often the case, the winds of war were beginning to blow again over the northern lands. Ragnar Lothbrok, now ruler of Denmark, was beginning to consolidate his position in Sweden. Although he had achieved great victories in the 3 years that followed his arrival in Sweden, he knew that the path to victory was far from straightforward. The territory he had conquered was full of challenges, and the resistance of the Swedes seemed to give no respite. He had captured villages, taken fortresses, and imposed his rule over most of the southern tribes, but there was something greater waiting for him on the horizon, something that still required his watchful eye and unbeatable strategy. Victories came more frequently at first, as a breath of fresh air, but he soon felt the ground becoming more unstable. Each victory over his Swedish enemies was followed by a treacherous revenge. Tribes that had submitted to his power rebelled again, wanting to regain their independence. One battle in particular was a clear reminder of the hardships of his reign. Ragnar had advanced north into the Västergötland region, where a coalition of local tribes had united against him. The fighting was fierce, and although Ragnar was victorious, he lost several of his best warriors, temporarily weakening his fighting strength. But he was resilient. Instead of retreating, he simply reshaped his strategy, organizing his forces and retraining his troops. The Vikings under his command began to become even more lethal and disciplined. But as brilliant a leader as Ragnar was, something nagged at him. Sweden's true power lay not only in the lands he already ruled. The great challenge, the true prize, lay to the north, where the capital, Uppsala, the holy city where the High King of Sweden resided, stood. This was Ragnar's last bastion, his last challenge. Every victory and defeat over the past years had served only as a prelude to the final showdown, and he knew it. There were rumors among his own warriors that the city of Uppsala was imbued with more ancient, perhaps even supernatural, forces. Many Vikings spoke of the great sacred tree, Yggdrasil, which supposedly grew somewhere near the city, and that whoever held Uppsala would somehow gain the favor of the gods. For Ragnar, the city was not just a strategic point of conquest, but a testament to his supremacy. Taking the capital would undoubtedly mean securing the title of High King of Sweden, something he already felt was his destiny. However, as a leader of so many battles, Ragnar knew that the key to this final step lay not just in brute force, but in strategic patience. His time as ruler of southern Sweden had given him a unique understanding of the political complexity of the north. He knew that trust was a rare commodity, especially when dealing with different tribes and factions. As such, Ragnar had to maneuver cautiously, forging temporary alliances and challenging those who saw him as a threat. He also needed to ensure that his own army remained loyal, for great victories, as always, were closely linked to the spirit of his warriors. When he sat in his tent at the end of each day's battle, he looked out at his warriors, his eyes ever alert for any sign of weariness or doubt, and it made him uneasy. As a leader, he knew he could not waver. His empire, his dynasty, was on the verge of a great step forward, but Uppsala, with its vastness and mystery, still remained an unsolved challenge. Although his power had spread over much of Sweden, the High King, the final obstacle, was still there, waiting for Ragnar with the same unyielding resistance as ever. Ragnar felt, however, that the time was approaching. His army, now stronger, more experienced, was about to take a bold step towards what he knew was his destiny. But before he could take the next step, he needed more time, more planning. He had already shown everyone that he had strength and ambition. Now he needed to demonstrate that he had cunning. He knew that Uppsala would fall, but it was no simple task. Something bigger was at stake, and he knew that the battle for the capital would be unlike any other he had faced before. After 3 years of conquest and victory in Sweden, Ragnar Lothbrok had almost completed his rule over the land. His army, feared throughout the region, marched with determination, and his name became synonymous with power and fear. But as he came into view of the capital of Shalvam, where Sweden's High King, Sigurd, held his throne, a new challenge arose, one that would come not from a foreign enemy, but from within Ragnar's own ranks. The greatest betrayal came from Sverker, one of Ragnar's most loyal commanders, or so it seemed. With each victory, Sverker gained more power and trust, a position that fueled his secret ambitions. Over time, he began to question Ragnar's leadership, seeing himself as a better leader capable of ruling, a thought shared by many others who were willing to turn against the king himself, but fearful of being discovered. This culminated one dark night when Sverker, with a handful of officers at his side, incited a rebellion within Ragnar's own army. The betrayal was sudden and violent. One freezing dawn, while Ragnar was in his camp, his own troops rose up against him, attacking the weakest garrisons. By the time Ragnar learned of what had happened, it was too late. Many of his men had been drawn to Sverker's side, and those who remained loyal were outnumbered. The king, however, was not one to be easily shaken. He had weathered far greater storms in his life, and he knew that the price of victory would always be paid in blood. With a heavy heart but unshakable spirit, Ragnar called a meeting of his closest officers and set out for the battlefield. A showdown between the two former allies was inevitable. In the open field, surrounded by dark trees and a biting wind, Ragnar faced Sverker in a duel that would be remembered by all men who witnessed it. Sverker, still in his youth, believed he could bring down the great Ragnar, but he forgot the experience the king brought with him, an experience forged in blood and steel. The two dueled fiercely, their blades clashing with the rumble of thunder. Ragnar, driven by an unwavering sense of justice, finally defeated Sverker, plunging his blade into the traitor's chest. However, victory came at a cost. Ragnar was wounded. His army had lost many of its best soldiers, and although the traitor was defeated, the morale of the troops was shattered. But he was not a man to back down. His sights were fixed on the capital, where the real battle awaited. The aftermath of the betrayal was harsh. Many weeks passed after Sverker's defeat, and Ragnar found his army weakened, with many of his men returning to their villages, discouraged and tired. However, the sight of the Swedish throne, the last obstacle between him and complete dominion, gave him no rest. Ragnar knew that if he wanted to consolidate his power and rule as High King of Scandinavia, the time had come to take the capital of Shalvam. After weeks of reorganizing and recuperating, Ragnar gathered his forces, now more focused and regrouped, and marched towards the great city, with the fury of a man who had already tasted the bitter taste of betrayal and would not allow it to stop him. He knew that the final confrontation, against Sigurd and his army, would be the final test of his ascension. Ragnar was prepared to take the capital of Shalvam and become High King of Sweden. The journey to the capital would be long and difficult, but Ragnar had no more to stop him. He had faced the betrayal of his own blood and emerged victorious, and now he marched to the final battle that would define his destiny. Ragnar Lothbrok and his men marched for days, their boots crunching on the frozen Swedish soil, while the bitter wind blew through the dense forests around them. Although his army had suffered the bitter losses of betrayal, his heart was aflame with the desire to achieve his destiny. He knew that victory lay not only in taking the capital of Shalvam, but in becoming the High King of Sweden. He had already conquered much of the land, but the last stronghold, the last stand, lay before him, and Ragnar would not allow himself to falter. The siege of the capital began on a dark morning, as the outlines of Shalvam's towers began to stand out against the horizon. The city walls were imposing, and the Swedish soldiers, led by Sigurd, were prepared to defend to the last man. But Ragnar did not fear the walls. He feared only one thing, failure. And failure, he knew, would mean that Denmark would never truly be his, and that his name would not be remembered in the future songs of the Skalds. He was willing to do whatever it took. The first day of the siege was a series of quick attacks and ambushes. Ragnar, with his few men, used his cunning to ambush the patrollers, slowly weakening the city's defenses. He did not need a quick victory. What he needed was to weaken Sigurd's men, to force them to hide behind the walls, making the city feel completely besieged. 4 days, Ragnar and his troops attacked the fortifications, knowing that time was against them. Hunger was beginning to set in, and resources were limited. Each battle they fought was another ordeal, another test. The siege was taking place not only within the stone walls, but within every Viking heart that marched alongside Ragnar. They fought, yes, but the weight of scarcity was weighing heavily on them, causing the spirit of many to begin to falter. By the 3rd week of the siege, the battle had become even fiercer. Ragnar, with his unparalleled combat experience, began to lead bolder raids against the walls. His troops were small, but he led them with the drive of a man who knew what he wanted. He was not just a king. He was a warrior, and he was here to claim his right to rule. One night, during a surprise attack, Ragnar destroyed one of the city's defensive towers, creating a significant gap in the walls. Sigurd, feeling the pressure, sent his best forces to counterattack. But like a cunning Viking, Ragnar had prepared a bolder plan. Rather than wait for another direct attack, Ragnar used the darkness of the night to launch an unprecedented maneuver. He infiltrated with a small force and stormed one of the city's secondary gates. The battle inside the city was brutal. Ragnar, sword in hand, cut down any man who dared to cross his path. The ground of Shalvam became a mixture of blood and ice, and the screams of the warriors mixed with the sound of blades cutting through the air. Sigurd's defenders were outnumbered, and the city began to crumble under Ragnar's relentless attacks. The fight for the city lasted another full day, and the siege, which seemed endless, reached its climax. Ragnar, exhausted but tireless, led his troops on a final charge, breaking through the city's last defenses. His men, although tired, were united, and the roar of Ragnar's troops was louder than ever. Sigurd, seeing that his army could no longer hold back the invaders, tried to organize a last line of defense in the central square. But, as always, Ragnar was unbeatable. When Ragnar finally faced Sigurd, the Swedish leader was surrounded by an elite bodyguard, all ready to give their lives to defend their king. The final battle was a dance of destruction, a combat as fierce as any Ragnar had faced before. He cut through flesh and bone, facing Sigurd with the skill of a true warrior. Sigurd, for his part, was not a weak man, but Ragnar's determination, his will to become the High King of Sweden, was stronger. With one precise blow, Ragnar felled Sigurd. The Swedish king fell to the ground in the square, his sword slipping from his hands as the life left his body. Ragnar, panting and blooded, looked up at the man who had challenged his ascension. Silently, he approached Sigurd and, with a look of superiority, touched his sword to the chest of his fallen enemy. It was not just a military victory, but a victory of spirit, of a man who had conquered every inch of his journey with blood, sweat, and the indomitable fire of a true leader. When the city finally calmed down and the dust of battle had cleared, Ragnar stood in the center of Shalvam, his gaze piercing over the remaining men. They looked up at him with reverence, recognizing him not only as the conqueror of their lands, but as the man who had united them under his banner. Ragnar, sword in hand and gaze fixed on the horizon, knew that he was not just the king of Denmark now. He was the High King of Sweden, the man who had earned all that was due him. The sound of trumpets echoed through the streets of the Swedish capital, and the skalds, who had witnessed the grandeur of his journey, began to sing the ancient songs of a Viking king who would settle for nothing less than the whole world at his feet. Ragnar Lothbrok's accession was complete. He was the High King of Sweden. And so, my warriors and maidens, with the crackling of burning wood and the flames dancing like the spirits of ancient warriors, I tell you the end of Ragnar Lothbrok's journey. He, the son of the dragon, the Iron Heart of Denmark, who made the world tremble beneath the weight of his sword, has finally reached the pinnacle of his ascent. After so many trials and so many battles, Sweden, with its dense forests and icy mountains, has become his domain. The sound of a trumpet was heard in the cold lands, announcing his victory. On the hills of Shalvam, where the blood of the brave mingled with the snow, Ragnar Lothbrok looked down upon the ruins of the city that had once been King Sigurd's stronghold. He now, with the steady gaze of a man forged in battle, took his place on the throne. The High King of Sweden no longer saw himself as a mere man. He was a monster, a conqueror, a king who had transcended the ancient boundaries of mortality. And that day, as the sun sank behind the mountains and the stars began to appear like fires in the sky, Ragnar stood before his new land. He felt the weight of the crown upon his head, not as a burden, but as a symbol. The symbol of a man who had fought with all the strength of his soul to be what destiny had promised him. He looked at the soldiers who remained, those who had survived the siege and the relentless fighting. They stood before him now, dirty, tired, but with eyes shining with immense pride. They knew that Ragnar, the one who had defied the fiercest winds and the most fearsome enemies, was now the king who would lead them further, to new lands, to greater conquests. The wind cut through the city walls, and the flames of the bonfire danced like the spirits of the fallen warriors, those who had marched beside Ragnar and fought to their last breath. The skalds' words, in their eternal wisdom, echoed through the freezing night, like the songs of the forgotten heroes who once walked beside Ragnar Lothbrok. Those who died for their lands became kings, but immortal is he who won the hearts of his people and stood like a god in the face of victory. And so, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok was carved into the stones of Sweden, in the very lands he now ruled. The High King of Denmark and Sweden, the indomitable warrior who became more than a man, and became an eternal figure, immortalized in the songs that skalds, like me, will sing for generations to come. And now, my friends, as the firelight fades and the shadows close in, let this tale be passed on, as all great tales are, from ear to ear, from generation to generation. For when Ragnar Lothbrok took up his axe and walked these lands, it was not just to conquer, but to become the legend itself. and his story will live on forever, until the lost Skald is silent. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.